Okay, now let me get my screen to share really quick. And this one is a little bit of a shorter presentation versus if you were here last week. It went a little longer. This one's not quite so long, so I won't keep you very long. But tonight, just going to be talking about some really kind of herd health things, management things. This applies really whether or not you have multiple horses or you're just boarding somewhere that has multiple horses. Either way, it kind of goes all the way across the board, whether you're in that direct position of management across the board or whether it's just you trying to make sure that your horse has the best care that's possible within a herd that someone else is managing. All of this is things to look for and be aware of. So the first thing is record keeping. Write everything down. Don't rely on your memory, especially if something came down to an emergency situation. You're not going to remember, unfortunately. And it also has to do with legally, if you are going to maybe move the horse or move several horses, it's much easier to have things on paper versus just saying like, oh, I think it was about this or I think it was about that. This makes it a lot more sure. And then as well, if you go out of town for an extended period of time, then this makes sure that whoever is taking care of your horses has access to everything that you know about the horse. So you're not just giving them like a 2-week history of the horse and something goes wrong and the vet's asking for a complete health history in their shot records, and someone doesn't have that. If you can keep everything down in a binder, either a binder for the whole herd of horses or a binder for each pasture, if you divide by pasture, however you want to do it. But really try to keep everything written down, and however is easiest, whether that be like typed or handwritten, however it is, just make sure that it's down somewhere. The best thing, the biggest thing is just your standard operating procedures for how that herd is managed, or if it's just a single horse in a boarding facility, for how that horse is managed. So that's going to be all of the rotation schedules of who's in during the day, who's out during the day, blanketing practices. If you blanket during the winter, this is feeding. This is basically everything of what you do during a normal day. So also just age, breed, markings, picture of each horse. The easiest way to do this is a copy of Coggins test. And honestly, if you have multiple horses living together, or if you show, or if you're in a boarding situation, all of those are things where like the horses will probably have a Coggins. So if you put a copy of the Coggins test in there, that's also like proof of, yes, they've had the Coggins. And also it's a really good like visual marker or identification for the horse, saying like, this is this particular horse and this is like all of its markings and basically all of the basic information that you have about the horse. It's health history, so it's normal TPR, especially horses that are more fit or less fit. Their pulse rates can change pretty drastically among horses. So having what's normal for the horse down, just their normal temperature, pulse, and respiration, and then also an up-to-date BCS range. So if you body condition score horses, it's a good idea to kind of have that idea of where they are normally. Once again, like if you're out of town for an extended period of time, or maybe if you're in a boarding situation where you're not over there day in and day out, it's harder to realize that, oh, this horse is losing weight, until you go out and look at it after an extended period of time. You're like, oh, it's skinny. And if something has happened that's lost its appetite, having that BCS history there to know like what its body condition score normally holds at during different times of the year is a good thing to look back on and be like, okay, this is normal. Like he always drops a little bit of weight in the winter. And it's just something to have, that even if the vet comes out and asks like, oh, is this normal, to have him be like, no, this is not normal. Like this is what is normal for him. All of your vaccination records, all of your farrier visits, have a record of which vaccines you give. And then I'll talk a little bit later, but if you even have like access to like the brand information, that's also helpful. But all of the dates of the farrier visits, what the farrier's done, if you've had any emergency farrier visits, try to write those down. That way you can keep up with the schedule of when your horse is shod, and then also any emergency that happened, any treatment that he has to receive that you can do. Vet visits are the same way, so this also goes for routine and emergency. Just making sure that each time the vet comes out that you're making a note of, this is what happened, this is what we did. I would make a note on like what kind of symptoms was going on when the vet came out. Just so like if that ever comes up again, you can look back, or someone else can look back and say like, yes, this has happened before, or no, this is really atypical for this horse. And then contact information for you, for the vet, for the farrier. That should be front page, first thing anyone sees when they open it, because it honestly doesn't matter how many times you put it in your phone, something always happens, it gets lost. So just having it there on the front page of any kind of binder or anything that you keep your records in can be really helpful in an emergency situation, just to keep things a little smoother and just to make sure that the emergency doesn't get more serious than what it already is. So next, just talking a bit about pasture management, which becomes really important when you have more than one horse, especially more than one horse on a limited amount of pasture. The best rule of thumb is to allow about an acre of pasture for each horse. That allows them to kind of graze it down. It kind of allows them to be a little bit selective, and normally you aren't going to burn out your pastures so quickly this way. You can keep horses on less. You just have to be very careful on how you manage it. You just have to watch and make sure that you're providing the nutrients that they need if they're not being able to graze it from the grass. So like rotational grazing, if you're going pasture by pasture, the general rule is you have to rest the grass when it's grazed down to 3 inches. So once it gets down to 3 inches, the horses aren't going to be able to gain anything from it. And when that comes, it's time to move them onto a different pasture and let that pasture rest and come back. So, and then once it's up about 6 inches again, 6 to 8 inches, that's when like it's good to go ahead and start grazing again. So it depends. It can depend a little bit on the time of year and even like the location of the pasture, the conditions of the pasture, and how long that takes. But if you have the space to rotational graze, then allowing those pastures to rest is one of the best things that you can do. And then if pasture is limited, you don't really have the space to do that. And then there's also things you can consider, like letting them graze less than 24 hours a day. So a lot of horses are only on turnout anyway. I know my horse personally, it does much better when he's on 24/7 turnout. He does not do well in a stall. He really hates it. Some horses like that. Some older horses or some horses with certain medical conditions don't do well being out in the heat of the day during the summer or during the really cold nights in the winter. So depending on what your situation looks like, you might consider letting them graze less than 24 hours a day on that pasture to kind of save it a little bit. You can also seasonally graze. So like I said, like change what it is based on the season. Maybe in the winter when it's colder, you keep them in more. Maybe in the summer when it's warmer, you keep them in more so than you would in the spring when like the weather's a little bit more conducive to the horses spending all day outside. This also reduces selectivity. So basically what that means is that the horses, when they're put into a smaller pasture, will kind of eat everything. So in a larger pasture where they're allowed free access 24/7 and there's plenty of room, they're going to be a little bit selective. They're going to go after the best grasses. They're going to go after kind of what they want out of the field. And it can make it a little uneven. It can make managing it not a challenge, just a little bit more difficult. So once you're putting them into a limited pasture, it reduces the selectivity of the feed available to them. So they're kind of going to graze it down pretty evenly. So some other things are just mow pastures after grazing. It just keeps weeds down. It also helps with just that resetting process if you're rotational grazing. So after it gets down to 3 inches, or if you move them before it gets to 3 inches, just mow it down to that 3 and kind of like even it off. And it also keeps the grass from seeding out. And then try to drag your fields to reduce the manure. Parasites can be a big issue, and we'll talk about that a little later on too. But dragging the fields, especially if you have a smaller field or a lot of horses in an area, dragging the field kind of reduces the parasite load. It kind of spreads the manure out or takes out that manure and reduces the parasite loads that can be in the field. So barn setup, if you're looking at a barn, whether you're boarding or whether you're looking to build or renovate a barn, whatever it is, ventilation is one of the biggest things that you can keep in mind. So air should always be free to move. Stale air will naturally move kind of up and out, and then you can use fans to move it along the breezeways. So some of the pretty common designs, like if you go to a barn and look It's always good to kind of try to look and see how the air is moving, or like whether there is any kind of air movement through the barn, because something that's just letting the dust and the ammonia from stall bedding and stuff kind of gather can be detrimental to the horse. So a lot of barns will use fans along the breezeway, but once I have seen barns where just trying to get air in because it's really hot in the summertime, place a fan at either end of a breezeway and point them in toward each other, just try to get air in the barn. But really all that's doing is it's creating like a pocket in the middle that doesn't really allow anything to rise and move. So fans are a really good idea. They just need to be pointed. One needs to be pointed going into the barn. The other needs to be at the other end, needs to be pointed, pulling air out of the barn to try to keep that fresh air kind of continuously moving through the barn. Another way to do it, some barns will have ventilation areas up top where the air comes up from the roof of the barn, and then open eaves so the stale air will go up out of the top of the roof, and then the fresh air will come in under the eaves and go in. Another thing to look for is like, do the stalls have windows that can open individually? Because if so, that allows a lot of individual air movement throughout the stall. It helps keep the individual stalls pretty fresh. Another thing is what type of bedding, especially if you're doing a lot of horses. So if you're managing a herd of horses, what type of bedding you're going to use. One, affects your costs, and two, affects your labor, and kind of the whole makes ventilating a lot easier if you're using a more efficient type of bedding. So a lot of people use shavings. Larger flaked shavings are lower in dust than small shavings are. Small shavings tend to hold a lot of dust, and also like free dump loads of shavings tend to harbor a lot more dust and allergens and things versus pre-bagged shavings or pre-packaged shavings. Like kiln dried shavings are going to have a lower dust content than just a dump load that you have to store somewhere, because they'll gather moisture and they'll gather dust as they sit. So straw is usually used a lot in breeding. It kind of makes the best choice if you're breeding for mares about to foal out, because you can make that really deep bedding. And it's cheap. It's a lot less expensive than other methods of bedding, but it's really labor intensive. It doesn't really soak anything. So the idea is to just make such a thick layer of that straw that nothing really gets through it. And it just keeps a soft bed on top for the horse. But it's really labor intensive because you have to make sure that you're keeping that thick layer up. It's palatable, so horses will kind of chew on it and kind of eat it down. And you're constantly having to figure out like where to pull it and where to move it. So straw can be pretty labor intensive, and it also tends to hold a lot of dust, and it's going to hold a lot of ammonia because it doesn't really absorb the urine. It just kind of keeps it sitting under it, so there's nothing wet on top, but underneath it's still going to be really wet. Pellets, I've never personally used pellets as bedding. They're lower in dust. I'm sorry, I didn't finish that sentence. But they are expensive. So you're going to pay for using shavings, and then there's also a learning curve. They don't manage the same way that flakes do or other things do, where you just sift them out. They kind of like disintegrate and fall apart, and you have to be, takes a little bit of time to get used to how they kind of sift out. So, and over here is something I didn't hear about until recently. It's probably been around a while. I just haven't really heard of it, and that's newsprint for beddings. And apparently, from what I've read, once again, I don't have any experience with it. It was fairly new when I heard about it. Is that it has practically no dust, so it's very friendly for horses who have allergies or heaves or respiratory problems. So, and this is fairly easy on labor. So it's something I haven't really heard of, but it's a pretty neat alternative. They're just taking recycled newsprint and shaving it up into a type of bedding. So, okay, so biosecurity, I put in a perfect world because, like, in a perfect world, this is how it would work. Unfortunately, facilities just aren't always designed this way. And unfortunately, in the crazy part of the barn life, this also just doesn't always happen. But biosecurity is all about controlling the environment. So being able to take everything that's going on within the environment and kind of control what comes into it, and also what spreads among the environment. So a lot of people think about it when they're traveling or even when they're bringing in a new horse. So if you show, a lot of times you'll think biosecurity when you bring it to the show ring, like you're a lot more careful not to let horses touch noses, or you're a lot more careful to try to use your own equipment, but not so much when you're home. But it's also pretty important when you're at home as well. It just kind of stops things before they get a chance to get going. So quarantine, anytime you bring a new horse into an environment, ideally you're going to quarantine them for a few weeks. 3 weeks is kind of that ideal place. It doesn't always happen. A lot of times it looks more like a week to 10 days. But 3 weeks is kind of that golden number that you want to shoot for, where you're keeping them kind of by themselves, and letting them, just watching them to make sure that they aren't going to show any signs of anything that's contagious. Also, ideally, any horse with a fever or diarrhea is going to be isolated until that they're proven not contagious. Fever tends to be a pre-warning sign of something that's going to be contagious or something that already is contagious. So those horses are ones that tend to, you look at a little more and say like, okay, like, should I get them by themselves? Sometimes it's just not that easy. And then also diarrhea, which we also don't think about because there's a lot of different causes for diarrhea, and a lot of them aren't contagious, but salmonella is. And salmonella can cause severe diarrhea in horses. So ideally, these horses are going to be isolated until they're proven not contagious. Once again, that just doesn't always happen. But just know, like, these are things like to be looking out for if you see it, maybe to take a little bit more caution. Maybe wash your hands after you feed it, or take, like, if you're taking temperature. Before you move on to another horse, just try to limit exposure if you can't completely isolate it. So the big one is don't share equipment. So don't share brushes, don't share tubs, like feed tubs, water buckets, whatever that may be. Try to keep each one belonging to the horse that it goes to. Once again, it just doesn't happen, unfortunately. A lot of times, like, one, that adds up to a lot of costs. So if you're trying to buy like stuff to fill up a grooming bucket for each horse, then if you have 20 horses, then that gets a lot less cost effective than buying 5 sets split between the 20 horses. Same thing with like feed and water tubs. One gets taken out to be washed. They all get taken out to be washed. They just kind of get put back in, or you're fixing feed in the morning, you put one out, you leave it out, and someone comes by and picks it up and just throws it in another stall. It happens. When you need something, you just run and grab what you can find. But ideally, it's not best practice, just because things happen, unfortunately. And this is something, like I said, when you're traveling, it's a little bit more easy to control this and to make sure that, like, you're keeping your brushes and your feed buckets, and you're not really borrowing those out to people, just because that's kind of how things start spreading. And a lot of things can be spread at a show or at a facility like that, and then brought home to your herd back home. And then you have to deal with it kind of running its course through the herd. So another thing is just ask people to be mindful if they've been around other horses. When you have the vet come out, like, generally speaking, they're going to know, they're already going to have like washed their hands between calls and like make sure that they're coming to your farm clean, just because that's part of their profession. A big one, I've known people who are a little more uncomfortable with farriers just because they don't tend to do that and ask their farriers to just wash their hands when they get there. That's, I know people who do, I know people who definitely don't. That's honestly something I've never been super vigilant about. But it's good just to be mindful if, like, who's coming onto your farm has been around other horses, or who might have been exposed to something on another farm, and just kind of be mindful of that. And then ask, like, if you think it's necessary to ask them to, like, or maybe wash their hands or something like that. And then that's something to kind of use at your discretion. So I'm just going to go over some of the common contagious conditions that you see in a herd of horses, just because, especially talking about biosecurity and things like that. So the first one is strangles, and strangles gets pretty serious. It's one of the ones that if you have a horse with strangles on your farm will go under quarantine. It is highly, highly contagious. It's not pleasant. It is not good to deal with, and an outbreak gets pretty severe pretty quickly. So really the biggest symptoms are fever, a difficulty swallowing. They have kind of this really thick, discolored nasal discharge. It attacks their lymph nodes, so their lymph nodes become inflamed. And then about the only thing you can do for them is rest, soft food. Sometimes that we use antibiotics, sometimes not. It really depends on the case. This picture right here, this is actually a horse that has a really severe case of strangles, and you can see where those lymph nodes have kind of abscessed open and busted. So it can be obviously pretty painful, and management can be quite a challenge. These are horses that once it starts spreading, unfortunately, like there's very rarely ever just one case on a farm. So if one horse on your farm gets strangles, unfortunately, the greatest chances that you're going to have a decent sized portion of your herd come down with it, unless you can really get on top of it quickly and quarantine those horses down. So another one is rhino. You can get a fever with it, sometimes not. But you're going to have kind of that clear nasal discharge, depression, loss of appetite. They're not really going to want to eat. This one, a vet normally doesn't treat a whole lot because in a couple weeks they normally kind of recover on their own. And so rhino and strangles are two that there are vaccines for, especially if you have multiple horses or if you're traveling with your horse or if your horse is in a boarding facility. This is things where you are going to want to vaccinate all of the horses in your care for strangles and rhino if they're around other horses, because these are highly contagious. Equine influenza is actually, it's kind of like the flu vaccine for us, where there's so many different strains of flu. It's not always protective. So it's kind of, you have to make that decision whether you're going to vaccinate your horses for equine influenza or not. But they're also going to have that fever and the clear discharge that you would see with rhino, but they're also going to have this dry cough. So it affects both their upper and their lower respiratory tracts. And they're also going to get this dry, because of that, they're going to have this dry cough when they get influenza. Really the biggest thing for that one is going to be rest. And then depending on the degree of their fever, then they might get some NSAIDs to try to keep the fever under control. And usually the rule of thumb is like for every day of fever, they're going to be on a week of rest. So if they have a fever for 3 days, they're going to be on rest for 3 weeks before they're put back to work. So, and then salmonella, I talked about that a little bit earlier with kind of isolating horses that have diarrhea. Salmonella is the #1 cause of severe diarrhea in horses. And so it's kind of one that's going to present with a fever. And this one, your vet may use antibiotics to treat. They also might say to let it run its course, especially if you can isolate that horse away from the other horses in your herd, because they run the risk of destroying all of the good bacteria in the horse's system. So really, depending on the case, a vet might advise it's best to kind of let it run its course and not pull out the antibiotics. So if you have horses with contagious conditions that show up at your farm or one of them in your herd, quarantine is going to become a big thing. And I feel like that's something we've all become fairly familiar with now, with everything going on, that we've been quarantining ourselves. And it kind of runs the same with horses. You want to just keep them away from other horses as much as possible. Ideally, you're going to be able to set up a quarantine area, whether that's a field, whether that's a stall or a block of stalls, really depends on your facilities. So it's something to think about if you're owning your herd of horses or you have several horses. Think about where on your property, if something did arise, like what would you do with them? How would you shuffle and move your horses around so that you have an area as far away as possible so that you can kind of keep things under control? So if it's a pasture, the best thing to do is try to keep it, try not to share fence lines with other horses, try to make sure that there's a good deal of space between that pasture and pastures where the other horses are. If it's a stall, try to keep out on the end of an aisle. Try not to put them in the middle, because that's just going to be a lot more traffic back and forth, a lot more human and horse traffic back and forth. But you also want to block off that area once you do, and post signs. So a lot of times it's going to just say restricted area. I've seen like if it's a strangles outbreak, actually say like horses in this area have strangles or things like that, just saying like no one is allowed to enter unless you are here to care for the horses. So that's just something to be cautious of. And then don't share any kind of equipment at that point. So what is those horses belongs to those horses until they are well. So, and just don't bring it, the best thing to do is just don't bring it out of the quarantine area. Leave everything there to the best of your ability that you can. Ideally, you'll take care of those horses last. It just kind of cuts down on how much you're going to be coming into contact with other horses or even other people after you've taken care of those horses. If not, like sometimes it's just not always possible. Change your clothes, change your shoes if you want, or wash your shoes if that's not something you can do, if it's not something that is very easy to do with your situation. Think about having boot covers. This picture right here is a really good example. They have the gloves set up. Even if you're in an area where maybe you're not going to be able to wash your hands very easily, or it's hard to get back and forth, keep hand sanitizer and wear gloves. Wear gloves while you're dealing with those infected horses, and then make sure to at least try to sanitize your hands afterwards. A station set up to kind of dip your boots is a really easy way. This is just using like a diluted bleach solution to kind of rinse those boots off. And that's a really easy way, a really quick way to kind of stop things at the door, saying like, okay, and even this, having just a couple extra pair of boots to wear in that area alone and then putting them in the boot wash, that's also a fairly easy thing to do. But it's all about trying to minimize contact and minimize how you're spreading things. So just be smart about the order that you're feeding them in, the amount of traffic that's going by there, and then what you can do to kind of minimize that spread. I don't think it's particularly necessary to always have this like gown and glove and boot covers thing going on. That can be a lot very quickly, but you can do some pretty simple things just as far as washing your hands and dipping your boots or disinfecting your boots and taking care of those horses last. That stops the spread of things a lot faster than especially than if you were doing nothing. So, and then always try to wash or sanitize your hands after you come in contact with the quarantine horses. Even if you're going straight home, it's still best go ahead and wash your hands, just because you don't want to get that anywhere else where it can be picked up later and brought back into contact with other horses. So this is some common conditions that aren't contagious that you don't have to worry about quarantining for, but show up fairly commonly. And I'm just doing two. They're both respiratory. And they show up fairly commonly in horses. So the one is allergies. It's pretty simple. Some of them aren't super severe. A lot of horses get allergies seasonally. So it could present as hives. It could present as some kind of respiratory problem, so coughing or wheezing. It could present as a little bit of both. It really just depends on what that allergen is and how your horse is reacting to the allergen. I had a donkey that I was caring for a while at one of the jobs that I worked, where he was allergic to fly bites. So we were fly spraying him, but obviously like that doesn't keep them all off. So he was having these big open sores on his legs. And so it was just a management thing at that point, because you can't realistically keep every fly off of a donkey. So it was just a constant cycle of, he got bathed once a week, like he got a medicated bath once a week, he got medications, he got ointments and creams, he got fly sprayed, like you name it, he got it. And it was just, it's a treatment thing based on how your horse is responding to whatever allergen it is. And the best thing you can try to do is try to identify it by season. So if it's when certain types of pollen are really heavy, or certain things are in bloom, or maybe even when certain types of insects are in much higher populations than other times, or by their environment if it's a certain place. So a lot of bugs are a lot worse depending on the environment. If it's a wet, kind of a wet or a marshy side to a field, is it possible to move them to a different field? Or if it's a very dusty barn, are they allergic to the dust? You can have horses allergy tested and kind of get that as a baseline down. But the more that you can kind of identify and limit out before you try to go that route, the better, if you can kind of narrow it down beforehand. You and your vet can probably do a pretty good job of knocking it out. And then heaves, a lot of people refer to heaves as maybe like the next step up from allergies or like the equine equivalent to asthma. But it's just a recurrent airway obstruction. So you're going to hear them coughing. They're going to have a lot of intolerance to exercise. They just can't keep up that lung capacity at that point. A lot of them are going to lose weight, and they're going to develop what's called this heave line. So if you look, this is a pretty good picture. If you see this kind of indentation right here, that's what's called a heave line. It's due, they've kind of developed that muscles from where they've like so forcefully like expelled air or tried to expel air, and that musculature develops pretty unevenly, and so they get this kind of heave line right there. So that's a good way to kind of identify that. You can do things to manage this, and a lot of it is controlling. A lot of it's caused by dust. So the best thing you can do is look for ways to minimize dust in the environment, which is kind of about as easy as taking flies away from the environment. There's always going to be some. You're always going to deal with it. But you can soak their hay. That moisture kind of keeps the dust down. You can remove as much dust from the environment as possible. So whether that is moving them to a more pasture-based turnout and less time in the stall, if you're boarding, maybe consider like look at the barn, look and see how much dust is around, look and see how good the ventilation is. If it's your own barn, look at things you can do as far as maybe changing the bedding or putting them, maybe even it's just putting them closer to the end of a barn, maybe where they get a little bit more fresh air coming in, keeping a window at the stall open or at the back of the stall open. Things like that where you can reduce dust really helps these horses. So parasites, we see a lot of parasite resistance. It's been an increasing problem, but it's becoming even more of an increasing problem, and I think it's always going to be here, unfortunately. So normally what would happen is rotational deworming always used to be what was advised, especially in a herd of horses. So when you're managing a herd, the best thing they always say would be to treat all of your horses together on a schedule every 2 months, get them dewormed, and kind of keep rotating that out. Unfortunately, that's what built up to a lot of this parasite resistance. So now what they're really recommending is only worm when you actually have to. It's not so much as a scheduled thing now as a based on the horses that are in these fields. So fecal egg counts are kind of what they're recommending now, just to determine how high of a shedder that horse is, and then looking at if he's a low shedder, he doesn't need wormed or doesn't need wormed as often, versus a high shedder, you definitely need to take action. That's when you really do need to start worming. If your horse is having a high occurrence of tapeworms, then you're going to want to look for something with that praziquantel in it. So that's going to be all of your gold wormers or your plus wormers, anything with kind of those extra words in it to say like, this is an extra product. So I think maybe one has super in it. I don't remember. All those have the praziquantel in them, and that's going to be what you want when you're treating tapeworms. And then other than that, ivermectin and moxidectin tend to both be pretty efficient. And the best thing to do is after you deworm, so when you're deworming that field of horses, you're going to deworm them, and then you're going to rotate that whole field to a new field after you deworm them to bring them to a new environment, so they're not just picking up those same worms over and over and over again. So basically it's rotating clean horses into a clean field to kind of reduce that parasite load. And once again, that mowing the pastures and those dragging the pastures, those kinds of actions are ones that don't require dewormers, don't lead to parasite resistance at all, and they're things that you can do they're not super labor intensive, and they can actually reduce the parasite load quite a bit. So that's something also to keep in mind. Next is like vaccination schedule for your herd. Once again, this goes back to the record keeping, but have the vaccination records for every horse. And then the core vaccines, those are pretty simple, but Eastern, Western equine encephalitis, West Nile, tetanus, rabies. So those are your core around here. Once again, going back to Strangles and rhino being contagious, if you are managing like a herd of horses, or if your horse is a part of a herd, then those are ones that are pretty much, I would say, essential as well, just because they're going to be around other horses and they're really contagious, and it's much better to prevent than to treat. And then Potomac horse fever is one that's vaccinated a lot for in Virginia, especially horses that live near bodies of water. So this is actually transmitted by a bug that's in the water. So especially for horses that live near large bodies of water, it can be important to get them vaccinated for Potomac. Botulism, I think maybe one person, maybe two, that vaccinate for botulism. And it's really only recommended if your horses are eating out of a round bale. So a lot of times the thought process there, or the concern there, is that parts of maybe a rat or some kind of dead something has gotten caught up when the baling process was happening. And that's much harder to spot in a round bale than in a square bale, and that's where the botulism comes in. So if you're looking at, when you're making your feeding plan for the herd, when you're looking at feeding, if you're feeding them round bales, then maybe that's something to consider. Also, price-wise, is, are you going to add that botulism vaccine in for the herd? I do want to talk about just for a minute about vaccine failure, because it does happen, and there's a lot of causes for it. So it's not always anyone's fault. Sometimes it just happens. Temperature is a big thing, so they need to be kept cool. Once vaccines get hot, then they can lose their efficacy. This is why, and this goes for any species of animal, like dogs and cats too, like buying from farm supply. I know several people who won't, just because there's no real guarantee shipping and storage and that kind of stuff has kept the vaccines at a proper temperature and a proper environment to make sure that they're still just as effective when you give them as they could be, at least if your vet had given them, or your vet had brought them to you. So that's something to keep in mind. Actually, brand changes. So if you're changing the brand of the vaccine, then they can be not as effective. When you first change brands, they have different compositions and a little bit of different, like, added ingredients, just different techniques on how they're made. So changing brands can actually decrease how effective vaccines are. And that's when you might consider just going ahead and giving another booster. If a booster isn't administered correctly in the proper time window, or if a booster isn't administered at all, it's really important with these vaccines that when they get their first round, that they're boosted within the window that they're supposed to be. And if you're bringing in a new horse and you don't know their vaccination history, then the best thing to do is go ahead and give them the first series and the booster series just as if they hadn't had it before, because it's not going to hurt them. And it's going to give that immunity, that second jolt that it needs. Basically, it affects the body's memory, so the immune system's memory. When you give them the first dose of a vaccine, they develop a little bit of memory to the virus, but not as much as what's really efficient for keeping the horse from actually catching the disease. And then when you give them the booster, it really kicks in that memory process, and it's like, okay, this is the virus that you're talking about, and this is the virus that the body needs to fight against. So that's why you booster, and if it's not done correctly, then you can have vaccine failure where you vaccinate and they still get the disease. Disease exposure too soon after vaccination. So if this is the first round this horse has gotten, or this pasture of horses has gotten, whatever that may be, and you're giving vaccines, and then they're exposed to that disease within that boostering window, so they haven't had the booster and haven't had time to make an immune response to the booster series, then chances are the vaccine isn't going to do them a whole lot of good. So that's something else to keep in mind when you're talking about bringing horses in, or maybe young horses that are getting their first series or whatever it might be. That first window of time after you give that vaccine, before that booster series, there really isn't any immunity. So it's something to keep in mind, especially once again, if you're bringing new horses into your herd or changing up the vaccine routine of your herd. And then just introducing a new horse. Always do it over fences, and then kind of allow them this time for a hierarchy to develop. So I was at a job where we had 30 some horses and a number of smaller fields that we divided them up into. And we had some situations come up where we had to be throughout the summer, switching horses in and out of different pastures, and it kind of always was this stressor of they never got along. They never really had that time to develop that hierarchy in a couple of the pastures, and so we kind of had issues out of a few of them all summer. So the best thing I can tell you is don't switch the horses around more than you have to. Kind of allow them that time to develop the hierarchy in the field and let things settle down. And if that means, kind of letting them fight it out a little bit, obviously don't let them hurt each other or themselves. But if that means like letting them nip and kick at each other a little bit until they kind of establish that dominance thing, that's okay. That's normal. Just providing that extra space between feed buckets can be helpful. So if it's just making that trip down the field to feed, and line them up all the way down the field, and just instead of pouring in a line of food buckets, sometimes that's what those horses need, to get used to each other, so they kind of have that respect for their own space and respect for the distance, and the horses in charge. And then something that's important but that's hard is just realizing when it's not going to work out. Sometimes you're going to put two horses in a field that they both have dominance issues. They're both used to being king of the field, and then you put them in and they just will not get along. They will not settle down. And those are the horses that are just going to be constantly fighting and running the fence line. And when it gets to a point where you're looking at them and saying, this is dangerous for the people who's going to be caring for them, and this is dangerous for the horses themselves, then it's time to move one of them, and just reevaluate the options. I've seen people get hurt by just two horses who were very food aggressive, and they just could not work it out in the field. No matter what you did, they always found a way to fight, and I saw someone get between them, get hurt. It's never worth trying to wait so long that they end up hurting somebody. So yes, give them a reasonable amount of time, but also realize when these two horses are just simply not going to get along. And then consider your other options on where you can move them and how you can kind of work that out. So the last thing I'm really going to talk about is stress. Just because there's so many stressors when you're managing a herd of horses that you have to take into consideration, and stresses from other horses and stresses from the environment, temperature change, changing of the seasons, new pasture mates, old pasture mates. There's so many things that can change the dynamics. If you have a mare coming into heat, then that's obviously going to change the dynamics. If you're changing up their feeding, whether the timing that you're feeding, the amount that you're feeding. One of the hardest things is when you have a dominant horse who gets a very little amount of food versus a very non-dominant horse who requires a larger amount of food. Then trying to feed them and keeping the one from eating his and going and chasing the others off. I've been in that situation, and just making the management changes to kind of reduce that stress. And then exercise changes also affects the horse, so if they're being put into more work. And so these stresses, once you kind of recognize them and once you know, each horse is different. So what triggers each horse or what causes the most stress in each horse is going to be different. But once kind of keep an eye, and this is also something that's good if you're keeping records or when you're keeping records, to notice this horse really doesn't like this, or this horse really reacts badly when you try to change something up like this. Trying to make those notes so anyone else who's managing those horses can kind of see that and know that is really important, because it's going to have a lot of kind of negative reactions physically, emotionally, and it's going to filter down to you when you're trying to manage them or you're trying to enjoy them. So physical reactions, they can also they can actually have stiffness, they can block up their muscles, sweating, reluctance to eat. So a lot of horses, when they get stressed, go into this kind of survival mode where they're not wanting to eat as much. And then all of these things, all of these physical changes really can contribute to colic. And colic, can get pretty serious pretty quickly. So all of these are kind of the precursors to watch for. And if it's stress related, trying to minimize that stress when you can. And then the more annoying side of it, it can lead to a lot of vices, so cribbing and weaving. And those also can be related to boredom. There's a lot of different things, and there's Still kind of a lot of speculation about exactly what goes into causing these vices or why horses do it. We do know at least cribbing can be a learned behavior. So if one horse sees another horse doing it, then you can end up with a field full of cribbers. But all of these stresses can kind of be the first step to these horses developing these vices that are really undesirable and can cause management issues, because if you have a cribbing horse on a wood fence, then that fence is going to break down really quickly. They can really do a number on a wood fence. So, and then weaving in a stall it can just also be, depending on how serious of a weaver they are, it can actually cause issues, like even just trying to go into the stall and take care of them or clean the stall. And so all those are things to keep in mind as you go through. So that's it. That's actually all I had. I hope it was helpful in some way. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Okay. If not, I think, thank you for coming on. Thank you for, I know it was a little complicated with the new link and everything, but I thank you for logging on.